She was nobody. A lady with an unmarked name standing at the edge of a golden ballroom, counting the minutes until she could disappear. He was the Duke of Ashbourne, cold, untouchable, a man carved from silence and secrets, the kind of man women whispered about and wise ones avoided. They were never supposed to meet, but then, a carriage step, a gloved hand, and an outstretched arm that he held, far, far longer than was proper. That was the beginning of everything, and the end of who they both used to be. If you're new here, subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? The ballroom at Vauxhall Gardens smelled of beeswax candles, crushed roses, and the particular desperation of mothers with unmarried daughters. Lady Elara Whitmore had catalogued every exit. 3 doors on the eastern wall, 1 behind the orchestra, 2 flanking the supper table. A servants' corridor near the far left column, half hidden by a potted fern that someone had clearly placed there, not for decoration, but for the same reason Elara was contemplating escape: survival. She stood at the edge of the room in a gown of pale ivory muslin, empire waist, short sleeves, a satin ribbon beneath her bust that her mother had tied twice and then retied, dissatisfied with the bow. Her soft auburn curls had been pinned with tortoiseshell combs, and her white gloves fit too tightly at the wrist in a way that had been making her slightly mad for the better part of an hour. She was not supposed to be miserable tonight. She was supposed to be radiant. "You are the daughter of the late Viscount Whitmore," her mother had reminded her that morning, while Elara sat rigid in a chair and endured the trial of having her hair arranged. "That name still carries weight. You will smile, you will dance, and you will not, under any circumstances, say anything remotely interesting, because interesting women frighten gentlemen of means." Elara had smiled, a careful, hollow smile that she had been perfecting since the age of 14. "Of course, Mama." But now, standing in the glittering margins of a room that did not feel like it belonged to her, she let the smile fall. The season had begun 3 weeks ago. She had attended 11 events. She had danced with 9 gentlemen, none of whom had looked at her face for more than the length of a reel. She had been introduced, evaluated, and set aside, like silverware that didn't quite match the rest of the set. She was 22. By the standards of 1814 London, she was dangerously close to becoming a permanent fixture at other people's parties, rather than a guest of consequence at her own. It didn't matter that she had read everything in her father's library. It didn't matter that she could speak passable French, that she had opinions about Napoleonic foreign policy, that she had once reduced a pretentious Cambridge man to embarrassed silence with a single well-placed question about Greek philosophy. What mattered was the smile, the bow at her waist, the marriageability of her silence. She was reaching for a glass of lemonade from a passing tray when she heard it, that particular hush. Not the kind that fell over a room when the music paused, but the other kind. The hush that moved like a wave, beginning at the door and rippling outward as people turned, straightened their spines, and subtly repositioned themselves to be seen. Elara did not turn immediately. She had learned that turning too quickly gave too much away. But then the wave reached her, and she felt something she had not felt all evening. Something inexplicable and warm, like the air had changed, like the candlelight had tilted in a new direction. And she turned. He stood in the entrance. The Duke of Ashbourne. She had heard his name, of course, everyone had. Adrian Kincaid, the 9th Duke of Ashbourne, had been the subject of whispers at every gathering she'd attended since her first season 3 years ago. He was 30 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a fortune so considerable that even the most pragmatic fathers grew slightly reverential at the mention of it. But it was not his fortune that made the room go quiet. It was him. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall that required boots with hidden lifts, but the kind that came with a certain lazy authority, as though he had never once needed to stand on anything to make himself seen. He wore a dark coat, navy black, and a cravat tied with precise elegance. His jaw was sharp, his dark hair slightly longer than fashion strictly demanded, curling at the edges as though it refused discipline. And his eyes, from across the room even at this distance, were the color of winter water, grey and still and unfathomable. He scanned the room, not with interest, with assessment, like a general reading a battlefield he'd already decided to abandon. Elara realized several seconds too late that she had not looked away. and that he was looking back. She returned her attention to her lemonade with what she hoped was casual indifference. Her pulse, however, was not indifferent at all. It knocked against her ribs with unseemly enthusiasm, and she pressed her lips together and told herself firmly that she was being foolish. He was a duke. He would not notice her. No one of consequence ever did. The first time they spoke, it was not romantic. It was raining. The party at the Ashbourne townhouse, a different Ashbourne, distressingly, had run long, and when Ilara finally made her way to the front steps, the courtyard was a disaster of carriages and rain and very annoyed coachmen. Her own conveyance was nowhere to be seen. Her mother had departed earlier with a headache, leaving Ilara in the care of her aunt, who was currently pressing herself against the wall with an expression that suggested she blamed Ilara personally for the weather. The steps down to the street were wet, treacherously, humiliatingly wet. Ilara gathered her skirts and calculated the descent. She could manage it. Probably, if she was careful. She had placed her right foot on the first step when the slick stone betrayed her. Her ankle turned. Her stomach lurched into her throat. She caught herself on the iron railing, barely, painfully, and stood there for a moment with her heart hammering and her pride in serious distress. Careful. The voice came from beside her, low, quiet, unhurried. She looked up. The Duke of Ashbourne was standing one step below her, having come up from the street, apparently impervious to rain, his hat already in hand. He was closer than she'd expected. She could see the faint lines near his eyes that painted portraits would never capture, the marks of a man who had spent time outdoors, who had perhaps been somewhere other than ballrooms and calling rooms for meaningful portions of his life. He extended his hand, not with a bow, not with a speech, not with the theatrical gallantry that some gentlemen performed, simply a hand, offered. She stared at it for a half-second too long. Then she took it. His grip was firm and warm and absolutely steady, his gloved fingers closing around hers, with a quiet certainty that she felt travel all the way up her arm and settle somewhere in the center of her chest. He guided her down the remaining steps with unhurried ease, and she stepped onto the cobblestones safely, and she thought, "That is over, let go now, let go." He did not let go. Not immediately. Not at the proper moment. He held her hand in that careful, precise grip for 3 full seconds longer than propriety required, and in those 3 seconds, Ilara Whitmore ceased to breathe. Then he released her. He put his hat on his head, said, "Miss," and paused, as though waiting. "Whitmore," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "Lady Ilara Whitmore." Something flickered across his face, barely there, gone before she could read it. "Lady Ilara." He inclined his head. "Watch your step." And then he walked away into the rain, unhurried and unbothered, as though he had not just turned her world upside down with the holding of a hand. She stood on the wet cobblestones, rain dotting her sleeves, and watched him go. 3 seconds, she thought. Why 3 seconds? She had no answer. She would think about those 3 seconds for the next 2 weeks. Adrian Kincaid did not attend social events because he enjoyed them. He attended them because they were useful, because there were men in London whose cooperation he required and whose vanity demanded to be stroked in gilded ballrooms rather than offices, because his solicitor had told him, in so many words, that charm applied in the right setting was worth more than a letter and 2 meetings. He had learned at a young age to separate what was necessary from what was desirable. Most things fell in the first category, almost nothing in the second. He stood in the library of his Grosvenor Square townhouse the morning after the Ashbourne party, holding a letter he had read 3 times and had not yet answered. Outside, the city moved through its grey morning routines. His secretary would arrive within the hour. There were contracts to review, a dispute between 2 tenants on his Somersetshire estate, and a question about the drainage on the North Field that had been unresolved for 2 years and showed every sign of remaining so. He put the letter down, picked it up again. Lady Ilara Whitmore. He did not know why he remembered the name with such clarity. He met dozens of people at these events. He catalogued them by usefulness and forgot the rest by morning. But he remembered her hand, small-gloved, gripping the iron railing with white-knuckled stubbornness, before she'd accepted his help. He remembered the precise moment she had taken his offered hand, that half-second of hesitation that had not been coy, not performed, but genuine. The hesitation of a woman who was not accustomed to being helped and wasn't sure she wanted to be. He remembered that he had held her hand longer than was proper. He had not intended to. He had simply not released it when he should have, and for the life of him, standing in his library with his letters and his responsibilities and his carefully ordered life, he could not explain why. Adrian Kincaid was not impulsive. He was not careless. He was a man who had inherited, at the age of 19, a dukedom in moderate financial disrepair and a family secret significant enough that he had spent the past decade ensuring it remained buried. He had rebuilt the Ashbourne estates through rigorous management. He had restored the fortune. He had maintained at great personal cost a reputation for absolute reliability and emotional restraint. He was not a man who held a stranger's hand 3 seconds too long and then spent the next morning thinking about it. He set the letter aside. He did not think about Elara Whitmore again. He almost believed it. The second time they encountered each other was not accidental, or rather it was accidental enough that neither of them could be accused of contrivance. Lady Fenwhistle's afternoon musical was the sort of event that Adrian normally declined, but Lady Fenwhistle was the aunt of a man whose vote he needed in 3 weeks, and so he had accepted, and he was now seated in a row of gilded chairs in a room that was too warm and too small for the number of people crammed into it, listening to a soprano with admirable lungs perform an Italian aria of considerable length. He heard her laugh before he saw her. Not a giggle, not the polished, socially acceptable feminine sound he had come to expect at these events. A real laugh, low and quick and involuntary, cut off almost immediately as though she'd surprised herself with it. He turned his head. She was 2 rows ahead, sitting beside a woman in a turban who appeared to have fallen asleep, which explained the laugh. Her back was to him. He could see the line of her neck, the soft curls pinned at the back of her head, the ivory and rose of her gown. As though she felt his eyes, which was absurd, the room was full of people, she turned her head slightly, not enough to look at him directly, just enough that he could see the curve of her jaw, the almost smile she was pressing back into composure. He faced forward again. The aria continued. His attention did not. When the musicale concluded, and the guests rose and redistributed themselves in search of refreshments, he found himself, without any clear intention, moving toward the corner where she stood. She saw him coming. He could tell because her spine straightened in that particular way, not stiffening, not retreating, but preparing, as though she was arranging herself before something she expected to require composure. "Your Grace," she said, when he was close enough. "Lady Elara." He paused beside her, looked at the room rather than at her, which was somehow easier and harder in equal measure. "You found the aria entertaining?" "I found my Aunt Cecily snoring a worthy counterpoint to it." The soprano was overmatched. A pause, and then she turned to look at him fully this time, and he discovered that her eyes were a dark, intelligent amber, the color of autumn, and that they were currently looking at him with an expression he could not quite categorize. Not admiration, not wariness, something more difficult than either. Curiosity, he realized. She was simply straightforwardly curious. He was not used to that. "You are very direct for a duke," she said. "You are very honest for a debutante." "I am 22, she said. "I've rather passed the stage of debutante anxiety." "What stage is this, then?" she considered. "Comfortable indifference," she said, and smiled. And it was not the polished, careful smile he had seen on her face at the Vauxhall ball. It was smaller and more real and entirely more dangerous. He stayed beside her for 20 minutes. He told himself it was because the conversation was interesting, which it was. She had opinions about romantic poetry that she expressed with a precision that caught him off guard, and a dry humor that she deployed without apology, and she asked him at one point what he thought about the recent parliamentary debate on land enclosure, with the apparent genuine belief that he might have a worthwhile answer. Most people did not ask him what he thought about anything real. They asked him what his opinion was of the weather and the evening's entertainment, and whether he had enjoyed the country this summer. Careful, frictionless questions that required nothing and revealed nothing. Elara Whitmore asked him about land reform, with the attention of someone who actually wanted to hear the answer. He gave her one, a real one, and she argued with 2/3 of it. He walked home that evening, turned down the offer of his carriage for the first time in years, and thought, this is dangerous. Not her. The wanting, the specific, focused, unprecedented wanting to know what she would say next. Spring deepened. London exhaled into lilac-scented warmth. The season gathered speed. They saw each other at 6 more events over the following fortnight. They did not seek each other out, or if they did, neither acknowledged it. But they found themselves in the same corners, gravitating toward each other with the slow, inevitable quality of tide. Their conversations were never long, never scandalous. Every rule of propriety was observed to the letter, but she had started to read him. She noticed things, the way the line of his jaw tightened when someone spoke to him with the particular obsequiousness of the socially ambitious, like a man enduring something with patience he preferred not to be asked to exercise. The way his eyes, across rooms, moved past people rather than to them, seeking exits the same way she did, which made something warm and strange stir in her chest. She noticed, too, that he never spoke about his past. Questions that touched on his family, framed conversationally by other guests, probing politely for soft spots, slid off him without purchase, redirected with a deftness so polished it looked natural. She watched it happen 3 times before she understood. Whatever Adrian Kincaid carried, he had been carrying it alone for a long time and had become very, very good at it. She told herself it was none of her business. She almost believed it. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a footman she didn't recognize. Lady Alara, I am told you have a library at Whitmore House that contains the 3rd volume of Blackstone's Commentaries, an edition printed 1768. I am also told by sources I am unwilling to reveal that you are not the sort of person who would refuse a reasonable loan of it. I find myself in need of it by Friday. Regards, A.K. She read it twice. She was smiling by the second read, which she considered a character flaw. She sent back the book with a note. Your Grace, Blackstone, as requested. I have taken the liberty of marking the passages on property inheritance, Chapter 9 in particular, which I believe may be relevant to your current predicament, if the rumors about the Halcroft dispute are accurate. The book is a loan. I expect it returned. E.W. He returned it 4 days later with 3 pages of marginalia and a note that said only, Chapter 9 was insufficient. I needed Chapter 12. You were right about Halcroft. She put the note in her writing desk. She told herself this meant nothing. It did not mean nothing. What Ilara did not know, and what almost no one knew, was what lived inside those locked rooms of the Duke of Ashbourne. He had a brother. Younger by 4 years, quieter by nature, softer in all the ways that the Kincaid family had been trained to view softness as weakness. His name was Henry, and Henry had, at the age of 18, done something that could not be undone, had loved someone he was not permitted to love, had been caught, and had been quietly, coldly erased by their father in the months before that same father's death. Not killed, not disinherited, something worse. Sent away, hushed, made into a secret. Adrian had inherited the title. He had also inherited the knowledge and the terrible responsibility of it, and the choice his father had handed him without asking, maintain the silence or ruin everything. He had chosen silence. He told himself it was pragmatism. He understood in the quiet of his own reflection that it was fear. And now there was Ilara, straightforward, honest, luminously intelligent Ilara, who had a way of looking at him that made him feel the architecture of his careful lies. She didn't know what she was looking at. She was simply curious, the way sunlight is simply warm without malice or agenda. But sunlight reaches into corners, and he had a great many corners he could not afford to illuminate. On the 14th of May, he almost told her. They were walking in Hyde Park, a chaperoned walk, her aunt 10 paces behind them, and not particularly interested in staying closer. The light was gold-green through the new leaves. Ilara had her hand on his arm in the correct light fashion of a lady accepting an escort's arm, and she was talking about her father, lost 3 years before, quietly mourned, clearly still present in everything she was. And he had been listening with the absolute involuntary attention she always commanded, when she said mid-sentence, I think the most painful kind of love is the kind that must be hidden. She wasn't talking about them. She was talking about her father, about something his illness had concealed, but the words landed in him like an arrow finding a particular unavoidable target. He stopped walking. She looked up at him, surprised by the sudden stillness. "Are you—" "I have a brother," he said. The words came out without decision, without rehearsal. She blinked, said nothing. "His name is Henry," Adrian said. "He is alive and well in Edinburgh, and no one knows this because our father decided, and I permitted, that his existence was an inconvenience." He paused. His jaw was tight. His hands were still at his sides. "I have never told anyone that." The park moved around them, voices in the distance, the sound of children near the Serpentine. Her amber eyes were steady on his face. "Why are you telling me?" she asked. He didn't have an answer. He looked away at the lake, at the light on the water. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said in years. She didn't tell anyone. He had not asked her to keep his secret. He had not needed to. She simply held it. The way you hold something that was given to you by someone who didn't know they were giving it away, because they had finally stopped being careful for one unguarded second. She thought about Henry Kincaid often in the following days, about what it meant to be made into a secret, to be loved and erased simultaneously by the same person without contradiction. She thought, too, about the way Adrian had looked when he'd said it, not relieved, not guilty. Like a man who had been carrying a stone for so long he had forgotten the weight of it until he'd set it down for a moment, and felt, in the sudden lightness, what the weight had cost him. She did not know what to do with the ache this produced in her. She went to the Hartwell garden party on a Wednesday afternoon in a gown of soft blue muslin and told herself she was not looking for him. She was absolutely looking for him. He arrived late, which was apparently characteristic of him. She was learning his patterns, a fact she found simultaneously wonderful and alarming. He found her near the roses, or she found him. It was increasingly difficult to distinguish between them. "For you didn't ask me any questions," he said by way of greeting. "You didn't invite any," she replied. He looked at her for a moment with that winter-water gaze that had, over weeks, become somehow both more familiar and more unsettling. Most people would have asked. Most people would have told someone else within the hour. A pause. "I know," he said quietly. The roses were in early bloom around them, their scent heavy and unhurried. The garden party moved at a comfortable distance. For a few minutes, they simply stood in the improbable peace of it, and Elara thought, "This is the feeling I have been trying to name for weeks. It wasn't attraction, exactly, or rather it wasn't only that. It was the feeling of a space that fit, of a conversation that did not require translation." "I want to write to him," Adrian said suddenly. She turned. His profile was sharp against the sky, jaw set, eyes distant. "Henry," he clarified, unnecessarily. "I haven't. It's been 4 years. I sent money. That was easier than words." "Money is always easier than words," she said. "Yes." A muscle worked in his jaw. "I thought if I sent enough of it, that counted as something." He exhaled slowly. "It doesn't count as something, does it?" She wanted to take his hand. It was a strong, specific, thoroughly improper impulse, and she managed it with the application of 12 years of careful social training. "Write to him," she said instead. "Not a letter that justifies, just a letter that says you know." He looked at her. For a moment, one of those full, complete moments that seems to exist outside of time, he looked at her with something she had never seen on him before. Vulnerability, stripped clean of its usual armor. The look of a man who had expected, at best, to be advised and had instead been understood. He said nothing, but he looked at her like that for a long time. And when they parted half an hour later, he paused briefly and said, with his eyes somewhere near the roses rather than her face, "You are not what I expected. What did you expect?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Someone I could ignore," he said. He walked away before she could answer. She stood in the garden for a full minute, breathing the scent of roses, her heart doing things it had absolutely no business doing. The storm broke at the Cavendish Ball. June now. Midsummer London. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers, a room that could hold 300, an orchestra positioned on a raised dais that filled the space with sound so full it was almost physical. Ilara arrived to find, with the particular prescience of misfortune, that Lord Greenock was in attendance. She had hoped never to see Lord Greenock again in a context that required civility. He was older, fleshy, with the confidence of a man who had been told he was important for long enough that he had stopped questioning it. He had made her an offer at the end of the last season, not the romantic kind, the transactional kind, framed in the language of opportunity, but with a subtext that had made her feel afterward like she needed to step outside and breathe clean air. Her mother considered him a reasonable prospect. Ilara considered him a reminder that the world could be very small and very unkind. He spotted her at the supper table and crossed the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who expected access. Lady Ilara, his smile was wide. You're looking remarkably well. Lord Greenock. She kept her voice even, kept her glass steady. I heard a rumour, he said, dropping his voice to a confiding murmur that managed to feel like a threat. About you and the Duke of Ashbourne. I confess I thought it was beyond possibility. His eyes moved over her in a way that she refused to react to. I wondered whether it might be worth reconsidering certain conversations. There is nothing to reconsider, she said. Are you certain? A woman in your position. My position, she said very quietly, is standing quite comfortably on my own 2 feet, thank you. She moved away. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not. She didn't look for Adrian. She was not going to be that woman, the woman who needed rescuing, who looked across a room for a tall man to make the small men go away. She found a quiet alcove and took 3 controlled breaths. Did he say something that requires my intervention, or merely something that requires him to leave London permanently? The voice was calm, low, and exactly where she had told herself she was not going to look. She turned. Adrian stood at the entrance to the alcove. He had clearly seen enough or heard enough, or, she was learning, simply read the situation from the change in her posture, because he was watching her with an expression that was not kind exactly. It was something harder than kindness, protective in a way that was ancient and quiet and absolutely sincere. He said nothing actionable, she said. I handled it. I know you did. A pause. I'm asking whether you want me to. She looked at him. She thought of all the careful distances she had maintained, all the careful nothings she had allowed herself to feel, and then filed away under the heading of not for you. No, she said, but I appreciate... She stopped. He had moved slightly closer, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible from across the room, just into the small radius of the alcove, so that the distance between them was less than propriety usually permitted, and the sound of the orchestra seemed to be coming from somewhere very far away. Ilara, he said. She had never heard him use her name without the title, just her name. 2 syllables, in that low voice, with a directness that felt like a doorway opening. You should know, he said, that I wrote to Henry. She breathed in-out. When? Last week. His eyes were on hers, steady, warm in a way that was new, that she had not seen before and suspected he did not show easily. He wrote back. Adrian. She said his name for the first time. She hadn't planned to. He went perfectly still. I'm glad. The orchestra played on. They stood in the alcove at a distance that was not improper, but was something else entirely. Charged, close, full of all the things neither of them had said yet. He lifted his hand, the same hand he had extended on those wet steps 4 months ago. Unhurried, certain, offered. Dance with me, he said. Not may I have the honor, not would you do me the pleasure, just dance with me, like there was no possible world in which the answer was anything other than yes. She placed her hand in his, and the dance was not ordinary. They had danced before twice with the correct social distance and the correct social pleasantness. This was not that. This was a waltz in which they did not speak and did not need to, in which she could feel the warmth of his hand through the thin silk of her glove, in which she had the distinct, dizzying sense that he was keeping her very close, closer than was strictly required, and that she was unambiguously letting him. When the music ended, he did not release her hand immediately. 3 seconds, 5, 7, his eyes on hers. Say it, she thought, with a fierceness that surprised her. Say whatever it is before you lock it up again. But someone called his name from across the room. The moment shattered. He stepped back, the wall came down, and the Duke of Ashbourne was once again composed and impeccable and impenetrable. But he had looked at her. She had seen. The Halcroft crisis arrived with bad timing, as crises do. She heard about it at a morning call. Lady Pemberton, whose husband sat in the same circles as Adrian's solicitor, mentioned it in the careful, not quite gossip way of women who knew information had value. There was a challenge to the Ashbourne title, something old, something legal, something that had apparently been waiting in a solicitor's drawer like a poison letter. A disputed claim, a question of legitimacy, a name in the records that connected, in ways she did not yet understand, to the secret about Henry. Elara sat in Lady Pemberton's sitting room with her teacup and her careful smile, and understood that the thing Adrian had been afraid of was happening. She sent him a note that evening. I heard. I'm not asking questions, but I am here, if there is anything I can do. He did not respond for 2 days. When he did, the letter was short. There is a document. My father had it produced years ago to protect the family name. It would undo Henry's erasure, which should be a good thing, except that it also contains information that would make the current inheritance challenge impossible to dismiss. If I use it, Henry is restored. The challenge collapses. The secret ends. If I use it, everything I have protected for 11 years becomes public. I have been afraid of that for 11 years. I am less afraid than I thought. She read it by candlelight, sitting at her writing desk, and understood what he wasn't saying, that the fear was not of the exposure, that the fear was older and simpler, the fear of a 19-year-old who had inherited not just an estate, but a choice that was never his to make, and had been carrying the weight of it ever since, and had perhaps, finally, found someone who made the weight feel possible to set down. She wrote back one line, then set it down. He used the document. It was not quiet. The legal proceedings were brief, because the document was irrefutable, but the social aftermath was the particular London storm of whispers and letters and afternoon calls, where everyone pretended not to be discussing the thing they were absolutely discussing. Henry Kincaid's existence became known. His history became known, softened by time, by sympathy, by the general willingness of a certain part of society to romanticize what it had once condemned. There was talk, there was gossip, and then, as these things do, it gradually became something else, something survivable. Adrian sent for Henry. Henry came from Edinburgh on a Tuesday, and Elara heard about it from her aunt, who had heard it from the Hartwell housekeeper's cousin, which was how news always moved in London, sideways, underground, unstoppable. She was glad. She was also sitting in the small sitting room of Whitmore House on a rainy afternoon, abruptly, sharply terrified. Because she understood something she had been not understanding for 5 months. She was in love with Adrian Kincaid, not the performed social kind of love that one managed on behalf of an appropriate match, the real kind, the inconvenient, disproportionate, deeply inconvenient kind, the kind where you thought about him at odd hours and noticed that the world was quieter without him, and found yourself wishing, with a sincerity that was almost embarrassing, for a rainy carriage step and an outstretched hand. He had never said he loved her. He had held her hand too long. He had told her his secrets. He had danced with her like the music belonged to them, and looked at her like she was the only legible thing in a room full of noise. But he had never said the words. She was 22, relatively sensible, and had read enough novels to know that feelings required words, or they remained feelings. She was also, she admitted to herself with a private, rueful smile, completely and utterly at a loss for what to do about it. She was still sitting with this when, half an hour later, his card was brought up. He was shown into the sitting room, and he was not composed. This was so notable that Elara immediately stood, not from social obligation, but from genuine alarm. She had never seen him not composed. He was always contained, always arranged, always the polished and impenetrable Duke of Ashbourne. Now his hair was slightly disordered, as though he had run a hand through it too many times. His cravat was perfectly tied, but his jaw was tight, and his eyes, those winter water eyes, had something in them she had not seen before. Urgency. Elara. Her name again, direct, without preamble. "Sit down," she said. "You're alarming me." "I don't want to sit down." He stopped in the center of the room, turned to face her. "I have spent 3 days attempting to compose a rational approach to this conversation. I have written 4 versions of it. They were all terrible." She folded her hands. Her heart was doing something extraordinary. "The written version was always going to be inadequate," she said carefully. "Yes." He ran his hand through his hair. There it was, the gesture she had noticed. "Henry arrived yesterday." "I know." "He looks—" Adrian stopped. His voice for a moment was not the voice of a duke. It was the voice of a man who had been carrying something alone for 11 years and had, this week, set it down. "He looks like himself. Still, despite everything. I thought I would have to explain and apologize, and that it would be long and painful." A pause. He laughed. Within 10 minutes he made me laugh. I had forgotten that he could do that. She did not speak. She understood that this needed no prompting. "I have been making decisions based on fear for 11 years, he said. Fear of exposure, fear of scandal, fear of what my father's voice still says in my head when I consider anything that deviates from—" He stopped again, pressing his lips together. Then, quietly, "I have been afraid of this. Of you." "Of me," she repeated. "Of what it would mean to want you as much as I do." His voice was steady now, with the steadiness of decision made, and irrevocable. "You are, Elara. You are the only person in my acquaintance who has ever argued with me about land reform, told me what I needed to hear rather than what was comfortable, and kept a secret that was never yours to carry without being asked. You looked at me on those steps in the rain like I was just a person, not a title, not an inconvenience or an asset, a person." She had stopped breathing sometime during the middle of this speech. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would consider, whether there is any— I am doing this very badly," he said, almost under his breath. "You are doing it exactly right," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since the garden, I think, since the roses, since you told me to write to Henry and didn't ask me for a reason and looked at me like you already knew the answer." The rain tapped at the sitting-room window. Somewhere in the house a clock was ticking. The candles had not been lit yet. The afternoon light was grey and soft and filtered through rain-washed glass, and it fell across his face and made him look for once unhurried, like a man who had arrived somewhere. Elara crossed the room. She stopped in front of him. She looked up at his face, the sharp jaw, the winter eyes, the mouth that could be severe and had been occasionally around her, gentle. "I have loved you," she said, "since you held my hand for 3 seconds too long on those wretched steps, and I spent 2 weeks trying to explain it away." Something broke open in his expression. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet, undeniable coming apart of the last careful wall. He lifted his hand. That hand. The same one. He offered it. She took it. This time, he didn't let go at all. He spoke to her mother that evening. The conversation was, by all subsequent accounts, short and decisive. He wrote to his solicitor the following morning. He proposed to Elara in the Whitmore garden, in the early morning before London was properly awake, with no audience and no performance and no speech about titles or lineage or social suitability. He said her name. He asked his question. She said yes before he finished asking it, which made him laugh, a real laugh, open and warm, and she thought, there it is. That's the part of him I have been waiting for. She would hear it, she thought, for the rest of her life. She was right. 5 years later, Ashbourne House, Somersetshire. The morning came in through the tall windows of the master bedroom in long, golden bars of late summer light. Elara lay still for a moment, as she always did in these first minutes, cataloguing the particular piece of it, the warmth of the sheets, the weight and warmth of Adrian's arm across her waist, the sounds coming from down the hall that she recognized with the intimacy of a mother who had learned every tone of her children's voices. A laugh, high and clear, followed by smaller, faster footsteps, followed by a patient, beloved voice. "Careful on the stairs, James. Your sister is behind you." That was Henry's voice. Henry, who had been a shadow in Edinburgh, and was now a permanent, beloved, complicated, wonderful fixture in their lives, who had become to her children, quite simply, Uncle Henry, which he accepted with a grace that made her love him unreservedly. "They're awake," Adrian said without opening his eyes. "They've been awake since before dawn," she said. "James found a frog. There was an incident." A pause. "The frog is—" Released unharmed, Henry handled it. "Good." He pulled her slightly closer. His arm tightened around her. Outside, the summer morning continued its golden progress over the Somersetshire fields, over the gardens where roses climbed the stone walls, over the lake that James had decided was his personal domain, and Cecily, 4 years old and entirely unafraid of anything, had followed him into twice this summer. Cecily had his eyes, grey as winter water, with an intensity that made visitors slightly nervous and made Ilara, privately, adore her. James had her stubbornness. Adrian had pointed this out once with an expression of tremendous respect, and she had told him that was an extremely rich observation from a man who had once spent 3 days drafting a letter he could have sent in 5 minutes. He had kissed her instead of answering, which was, she had learned, his preferred response to being right. "The Halcroft matter is concluded," he said after a while. "Thomas confirmed it yesterday. We're done. We've been done for 2 years. "I know." His voice was quiet. "I still think about it." She turned in his arms to face him. He opened his eyes. Those eyes, still the color of winter water, but warmer now than they had been 5 years ago, as though winter had learned to carry spring inside it. "You did right," she said. "You have done right, consistently, for 5 years. I had good counsel. You had excellent counsel." She pressed her palm to his jaw. "You should remember that." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm. A quiet gesture, unhurried, entirely real. "I remember everything," he said, "since those steps in the rain." Down the hall the footsteps reached the nursery, and there was a laugh. James, uncontainable, wonderful James. And then Cecily's answering voice, higher and more imperious, and then Henry's patient mediation between them, and the sound of it all came through the walls of Ashbourne House like music. Ilara rested her forehead against her husband's. The morning light fell across both of them. The fields beyond the window were gold. The roses below climbed their old stone walls. He extended his hand. Even now, even here, even after everything. He offered it, palm up, unhurried. She placed her hand in his. He held it. And this time, as he had promised her, wordlessly, in all the days between that first rain-soaked evening and this golden morning, he did not let go.
I stood where no one ever looks, between the light and the door, a name they barely ever spoke, a girl they needed no more. Smiles rehearsed, words left behind, silence dressed in lace, just another night to disappear without a single trace. Then rain fell slow and time stood still. A hand reached out against my will. 3 seconds too long, you held on to me, and something broke free that I couldn't see. No words were said, but everything changed in the quiet, the storm. Nothing stayed the same. You walked like nothing touched your soul, like shadows knew your name. A man built out of careful walls and silence dressed as fame. But in your eyes I saw the truth, a weight you couldn't hide. And for a moment you let me stand just a fragile truth between who we are and who we care. You told me secrets you never said aloud, and I held them gently without a sound. You were never broken, just never seen, and somehow you trusted me. 3 seconds too long turned into forever. A moment so small that changed us together. Now here we stand, no walls, no disguise, just love that was built in the quiet between our lives. You held my hand and never let go.